Welcome to Wonderful Story, where love, drama, and unforgettable moments come to life. Get ready to feel every emotion in stories you won't forget. So let's begin. Part 1: The Night Without Names. Rain painted silver streaks across the glass walls of the hotel bar, turning the city lights outside into blurred constellations. Soft jazz drifted through the dim lounge while expensive whiskey burned amber beneath hanging chandeliers. Julian Hart hated places like this. Too loud, too polished, too full of people who looked at him longer than necessary. He adjusted the sleeves of his charcoal coat and stared down at the architectural blueprints rolled beneath his arm like they were a shield. His co-workers had dragged him here after the launch presentation for the Eden Crescent project, the biggest opportunity of his career. And now they were abandoning him one by one. "Come on, Jules, at least celebrate a little." His colleague Mira laughed. Already halfway toward the elevator with the others, Julian forced a small smile. "I'm celebrating internally. That's called anxiety." "She's right," another coworker teased. Julian sighed as they disappeared. Perfect. Now he could finally leave. He turned toward the exit, but the storm outside had intensified. Rain hammered the streets hard enough to blur the traffic completely. Great. He rubbed his temple tiredly and decided to wait it out with one drink. Just one. The bartender slid a glass toward him minutes later. "Rough night." Julian looked up and froze. The man sitting 2 stools away turned slightly at the sound of his voice. Tall, broad shoulders, dark tailored coat, sharp cheekbones illuminated by warm golden light. And eyes. God, his eyes. Cool gray, observant, almost lazy in the way they studied Julian without apology. The stranger swirled his whiskey slowly. "Depends," he said smoothly. "Are you asking him or me?" The bartender laughed and moved away. Julian immediately looked down at his drink. Fantastic. Now the beautiful stranger thought he was staring. "You looked terrified walking in here," the man continued casually. Julian frowned. "I always look terrified." A quiet chuckle escaped the stranger. It was unfairly attractive. Julian took a sip of whiskey and nearly coughed from the burn. The stranger watched him with amusement. "Definitely not a regular. I'm an architect, not an alcoholic. Those professions overlap more than you think." Julian finally smiled despite himself. The man noticed. Something shifted in his expression then. Something softer, warmer. "Dangerous." "You worked on the Eden Crescent proposal," the stranger said suddenly. Julian blinked. "How do you know that?" "The blueprints." Julian glanced at the roll tucked beneath his arm. "Oh." The stranger extended a hand. "Nathaniel Vale." Julian hesitated before shaking it. Big mistake. Nathaniel's grip was warm and firm, his thumb brushing slightly against Julian's skin before pulling away. Tiny movement. But Julian felt it everywhere. Julian Hart. "Nice to meet you, Julian Hart." The way Nathaniel said his name made it sound intimate somehow. Julian looked away quickly. "You're nervous," Nathaniel observed. "I don't like people." "That's unfortunate." "I'm people." Julian snorted softly before he could stop himself. Nathaniel smiled again, slower this time, and Julian realized, with alarming clarity, that this man was very aware of what his smile did to others. That should have been enough warning. It wasn't. 2 drinks became 4. The storm outside worsened while conversation between them somehow became effortless. Julian didn't understand it. Usually social interaction felt like walking barefoot across broken glass. But Nathaniel had this infuriating way of drawing words from him naturally. They talked about architecture, travel, music, failure. Nathaniel listened carefully whenever Julian spoke, like every sentence mattered. No one had ever done that before. "You overthink everything," Nathaniel said eventually. Julian frowned into his drink. "I know. You apologize before every opinion." "I do not." "You almost apologized just now." Julian opened his mouth, closed it again. Nathaniel laughed quietly. Julian hated how much he liked that sound. "What about you?" Julian asked. "What do you do?" Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "Consulting." "That sounds vague." It's intentionally vague. Julian narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Nathaniel only smirked. God, he was impossible. Hours passed without Julian noticing. At some point the bar emptied until only a few distant guests remained scattered across the lounge. The rain never stopped. Nathaniel checked his watch. Looks like you're stranded. Julian sighed dramatically. I knew civilization would collapse eventually. There's room upstairs. Julian's breath caught. Nathaniel said it calmly. Not arrogantly. Not presumptuously. Just an option. But the look in his eyes was anything but casual now. Heat crawled slowly up Julian's neck. I don't usually do this, Julian admitted quietly. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment. Neither do I. Julian knew that was probably a lie, and somehow that made it worse, because he still wanted to go. The hotel suite was warm and dimly lit, city lights flickering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian stood awkwardly near the doorway while Nathaniel removed his coat. You can still leave, Nathaniel said softly. Julian swallowed. He should. Instead, he stepped closer. Nathaniel's eyes darkened instantly. The tension between them snapped tight. Julian barely had time to breathe before Nathaniel's hand brushed gently against his jaw. Slow, careful, like he was waiting for permission. Julian leaned into the touch without thinking. That tiny movement shattered whatever restraint remained. Nathaniel kissed him, deeply, hungrily, like he'd been holding himself back for hours. Julian made a startled sound against his mouth as Nathaniel backed him slowly toward the wall. God, no one had ever kissed him like this before. Nathaniel kissed like a man completely certain of what he wanted. And somehow, terrifyingly, what he wanted was Julian. Julian tangled shaky fingers into Nathaniel's shirt as the kiss deepened. The world blurred. Rain against glass. Warm hands against his waist. The rough hitch of Nathaniel's breathing. Everything became heat and tension and impossible want. Nathaniel pulled back just enough for their foreheads to rest together. You're beautiful, he murmured. Julian nearly combusted on the spot. No one's ever called me that. Nathaniel looked genuinely surprised. They're idiots. Julian laughed breathlessly. Then Nathaniel kissed him again. Slower this time. More dangerous somehow. Because now there was tenderness beneath the hunger. And Julian realized too late that this man could ruin him completely. Morning sunlight spilled across tangled sheets. Julian woke first. For one blissfully disoriented moment, he forgot where he was. Then he felt the warmth beside him. Nathaniel. Julian turned carefully. Nathaniel slept on his side facing him, dark hair slightly messy. One arm draped loosely across the bed. Even asleep, he looked devastatingly attractive. Julian's chest tightened unexpectedly. This had been a mistake. A beautiful, catastrophic mistake. People like Nathaniel didn't stay. Julian knew that instinctively. He slipped out of bed quietly and gathered his clothes from the floor. But before he could leave, running away already? Nathaniel's voice was rough with sleep. Julian froze. Nathaniel sat up slowly, sheets sliding dangerously low across his bare chest. Julian looked away immediately. Coward. I have work, Julian muttered. Nathaniel watched him carefully. You regret it. Julian's fingers tightened around his shirt. No. The answer came too quickly. Nathaniel noticed. But instead of pushing, he simply nodded once. Will I see you again? Julian hesitated. The truthful answer scared him. I don't know. Nathaniel stood then, walking closer until only inches separated them again. Too close. Julian could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his skin. Nathaniel reached up and adjusted Julian's crooked collar gently. The intimacy of the gesture hurt more than the kissing somehow. Then I'll leave it to chance, Nathaniel said quietly. Julian looked up at him finally. Big mistake. Nathaniel was watching him with an expression Julian couldn't quite understand. Not casual. Not detached. Something deeper. Something dangerous. Julian's heartbeat stumbled. He stepped back before he could do something reckless, like stay. Goodbye, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on him. Goodbye, Julian. Julian left without looking back. But the entire elevator ride down, he could still feel Nathaniel's hands on him. And for the first time in years, he couldn't stop thinking about another man. Even though he had no idea that by Monday morning, Nathaniel Vale would walk into his office again and destroy the fragile balance of Julian's entire life. Part 2. The Consultant. Monday mornings were cruel by design. Julian stood in front of the conference room mirror adjusting his tie for the fourth time while internally preparing for death. Not literal death, professional death, which in architecture was honestly worse. The Eden Crescent project was everything. 5 years of work, endless revisions, sleepless nights. If the investors approved the final development proposal, Julian's career would finally change. If not, he exhaled shakily. "You look like you're heading to an execution," Mira said from behind him. Julian glanced at her reflection. "Maybe I am." She laughed. "Relax. The consultant is just here to critique the structural presentation." That sentence alone makes me nauseous. "You'll survive." Easy for her to say. Julian gathered his notes tightly and followed the team into the conference room. The long glass walls overlooked the city skyline, rain clouds still hanging low from the weekend storm. Designers and executives filled seats around the polished table while nervous energy crackled through the room. Julian sat near the projector, trying not to visibly panic. Then the door opened, and the world stopped. Nathaniel Vale walked inside. Julian's stomach dropped so violently he thought he might actually pass out. No. Nathaniel looked equally stunned for exactly half a second before his expression smoothed into cool professionalism. Impossible professionalism. How was he standing there looking perfectly composed after everything that happened? The CEO smiled broadly. "Everyone, this is Nathaniel Vale, the international consultant overseeing the Eden Crescent evaluation." Julian forgot how to breathe. International consultant? Nathaniel calmly shook hands around the room like he hadn't kissed Julian senseless 2 nights ago, like he hadn't touched him with unbearable tenderness, like Julian hadn't spent all weekend replaying every second in his head. Then Nathaniel's eyes met his. Only briefly, but Julian saw it. Recognition, tension, heat buried beneath restraint. "Mr. Hart," Nathaniel said evenly. Julian nearly died on the spot. "Nathaniel," he managed weakly. Mira looked between them curiously. "You two know each other?" Silence. Julian's brain completely malfunctioned. Nathaniel answered first. "We met briefly at the hotel after the launch gala." Briefly? Julian stared at him in disbelief. Nathaniel did not look remotely guilty. "Traitor." "Oh, good," the CEO said cheerfully. "That'll make collaboration easier." Collaboration? Julian suddenly had a terrible feeling. The CEO continued, "Nathaniel will be working directly with Julian for the next month at the remote site cabin while the final revisions are completed." The room blurred. "A month?" Julian croaked. Mira looked delighted by his suffering. "Yes," Nathaniel said calmly, eyes fixed on Julian. "A full month." Julian wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The meeting became a blur of charts and technical jargon Julian barely absorbed. Every time Nathaniel spoke, Julian's brain short-circuited, because now he understood why Nathaniel had seemed so observant that night. He'd already recognized Julian's project. He'd probably been evaluating him the entire time. Humiliation crawled beneath Julian's skin. Had Nathaniel laughed about it afterward? Had he viewed Julian as some nervous little architect easy to charm into bed? Julian's chest tightened painfully. He hated how much that possibility hurt. "And that concludes the presentation," Julian finished stiffly, trying not to look directly at Nathaniel. Silence followed. Nathaniel flipped slowly through the proposal documents. Julian braced for destruction. Instead, Nathaniel said, "The emotional intent behind the design is impressive." The room visibly relaxed. Julian blinked. Nathaniel continued calmly, "Most modern architects prioritize spectacle over humanity. Eden Crescent doesn't." Julian stared at him, because that was exactly what Julian had tried to achieve. Nathaniel understood it immediately. No one else ever had. The structural execution needs refinement, Nathaniel added. But the heart of the project is exceptional. Heat rose unexpectedly in Julian's chest. Praise from Nathaniel felt dangerous, especially because he wanted more of it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. People gradually filtered out until only Julian remained, gathering his papers with tense, shaky movements. He could feel Nathaniel watching him. "You're angry," Nathaniel said finally. Julian let out a disbelieving laugh. "You think?" Nathaniel leaned casually against the table. "I didn't know you worked for Eden Crescent. You also forgot to mention you're apparently famous in architectural consulting. You didn't ask." Julian glared at him. Nathaniel looked entirely too calm under that glare. "I feel manipulated," Julian admitted quietly. Something flickered across Nathaniel's expression then. "Regret. That wasn't my intention. But you knew who I was." Nathaniel hesitated. "Yes." Julian's stomach twisted. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "I recognized your work before I recognized you." Julian frowned. "What does that mean?" Nathaniel stepped closer carefully, voice lower now. "I've admired your designs for years." Julian blinked. "What?" "The Harbolite Museum competition. The Kyoto restoration proposal. The Riverside housing concept." Nathaniel's gaze stayed fixed on him. "Your work is distinctive." Julian could barely process the words. No one remembered those projects. Most had failed. "You're lying." Nathaniel looked almost offended. "I don't lie about architecture." Julian stared at him helplessly. This man was impossible to understand. "You still should have told me," Julian muttered. "Yes," Nathaniel admitted quietly. "I should have." The honesty in his voice made Julian even more frustrated, because now it was harder to stay angry, and that was dangerous. 3 days later, Julian found himself trapped in a car with Nathaniel driving through endless mountain roads toward the remote project cabin. Rain tapped softly against the windows while fog curled through the trees outside. The silence between them had become unbearable. Julian focused aggressively on his laptop. Nathaniel glanced at him briefly. "You're going to get motion sickness." "I'm fine." "You've reread the same page 6 times. Julian shut the laptop immediately. Traitorous behavior from his own eyes. Nathaniel's mouth twitched slightly. Julian crossed his arms. "Stop noticing things." "No." "God." The confidence in that single word sent warmth straight through Julian's chest. "Unacceptable." They drove another 20 minutes before Nathaniel spoke again. "You've been avoiding me. We spent one night together. And it was a mistake." The words came harsher than intended. Nathaniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Julian instantly regretted it. But he didn't know how to explain himself properly. Because the problem wasn't the night itself. The problem was how much Julian still wanted him afterward. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Finally he said softly, "You don't mean that." Julian looked out the window. He hated that Nathaniel could read him so easily. "You barely know me," Julian whispered. Nathaniel's response came immediately. "I want to." Julian's chest hurt. Rain continued falling steadily around them as the mountains grew darker. Neither spoke again until the cabin finally appeared through the fog. Large, isolated, beautiful, and terrifyingly private. Julian stepped out of the car first, breathing in cold pine air. The cabin overlooked a massive lake surrounded by forest and distant cliffs. No nearby roads, no neighbors, just silence. "We'll be here for 4 weeks," Nathaniel said behind him. Julian turned slowly. Nathaniel stood only a few feet away now, coat darkened slightly by rain, gray eyes unreadable. The memory of those same eyes watching him in bed flashed violently through Julian's mind. He looked away immediately. This was going to be a disaster. A complete, catastrophic disaster. And somehow, the worst part was that a small piece of him was already looking forward to it. Part 3, the cabin rules. The cabin had 3 floors. That was the first problem. The second problem was that there was only one bedroom. Julian stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the massive king-sized bed visible through the loft railing upstairs. "No," he said immediately. Nathaniel set their bags down calmly. "It's a very large bed. That's not the issue. It's memory foam." Julian whipped around. "Nathaniel." Nathaniel finally smiled slightly. The man looked far too pleased with himself. "There's also a couch," Nathaniel offered. Julian looked toward the couch. It was beautiful, elegant, leather, absolutely too small for a grown man to sleep on for a month. Nathaniel followed his gaze. "You can have the bed." Julian frowned. "Why are you being nice about this?" Nathaniel shrugged off his coat slowly. "Because I don't want you uncomfortable." That answer hit harder than it should have. Julian looked away quickly and wandered toward the floor-to-ceiling windows instead. The lake stretched endlessly beyond the trees, dark beneath the cloudy sky. It was breathtaking, and far too isolated. No escape routes, no distractions, no co-workers buffering the tension between them. Just Nathaniel. Julian's pulse immediately betrayed him at the thought. "You're spiraling again," Nathaniel observed quietly behind him. Julian groaned. "Please stop being able to tell. I'd have to stop looking at you." Silence. Julian turned slowly. Nathaniel stood near the kitchen island now, sleeves rolled up slightly, watching him with that same calm intensity that always made Julian feel transparent. Dangerous man. Julian crossed his arms defensively. "We need rules." Nathaniel tilted his head. "Rules? Yes. Interesting. I'm serious." Nathaniel walked closer, expression unreadable. "All right, what are the rules?" Julian forced himself to maintain eye contact. "We are co-workers here." Nathaniel nodded once. "No flirting." Nathaniel's mouth twitched. "No discussing what happened at the hotel." Another nod. "And absolutely no." "You're blushing." Julian nearly combusted. "I am not." "You are." Nathaniel sounded delighted by this fact. Julian hated him, mostly because he looked unfairly attractive standing there in soft cabin lighting with rain shadows moving across his face. "This is exactly why we need rules," Julian muttered. Nathaniel studied him for a moment before saying quietly, "You can make all the rules you want, Julian." The way he said it felt loaded somehow. Then Nathaniel stepped past him toward the kitchen. "But we both know the problem isn't the rules." Julian's stomach tightened. Because, unfortunately, Nathaniel was right. Work began the next morning. Or at least Julian attempted to work. Unfortunately, Nathaniel existed within visible range, which made concentration impossible. Julian sat at the long wooden table surrounded by blueprints while Nathaniel reviewed structural reports nearby. The cabin was quiet except for rain and occasional page turns. Domestic. The realization unsettled Julian immediately. Nathaniel looked up suddenly. "You're staring." Julian snapped his gaze back to the blueprint. "I'm literally not. You've been holding the same pencil for 10 minutes. Traitorous hands." Julian glared at him. Nathaniel looked entirely unbothered. "How are you real?" Julian demanded. Nathaniel blinked slowly. "Biologically, you're impossible." "That's not an answer." Julian dropped his pencil dramatically. "Do you enjoy tormenting me?" "A little." At least he admitted it. Julian groaned into his hands. Nathaniel's quiet laughter filled the room again. God, that sound was becoming a serious issue. By the 5th day, the tension inside the cabin had evolved into something unbearable. Not awkward. Worse, comfortable. Nathaniel cooked while Julian worked. Julian made coffee every morning exactly how Nathaniel liked it without meaning to memorize it. They argued over design philosophy, shared late-night whiskey beside the fireplace, existed around each other with increasing ease. And Julian was absolutely panicking about it, because Nathaniel wasn't what he expected. He wasn't arrogant despite his reputation, wasn't cold despite his sharp professionalism. He noticed things, tiny things, the way Julian rubbed his wrist when stressed, how he skipped meals when overwhelmed, how silence comforted him more than conversation. Nathaniel paid attention to him constantly. No one ever had before. That was the real danger. Not the attraction. The care. One night Julian woke around 2 a.m. thirsty and wandered downstairs wearing only sweatpants and an oversized shirt. Big mistake. Nathaniel sat on the couch reading beneath warm lamplight, glasses resting low on his nose. Julian stopped mid-step, because somehow this version of Nathaniel felt even more unfairly attractive than usual. Relaxed, sleepy, barefoot. Nathaniel looked up immediately. Their eyes locked. Then Nathaniel's gaze drifted slowly downward. Julian suddenly became painfully aware of how loose his shirt collar hung over one shoulder. Heat flooded his face instantly. Nathaniel closed the book carefully. "You should go back upstairs," he said quietly. Julian's pulse stumbled. "Why?" Nathaniel held his gaze for a long moment. "Because I'm trying very hard to respect your rules." The air shifted instantly. Heavy, warm, dangerously intimate. Julian swallowed hard. Nathaniel looked away first, jaw tightening slightly. That tiny crack in his composure affected Julian far more than it should have. Because Nathaniel always seemed controlled. Seeing restraint cost him something. God. Julian walked slowly toward the kitchen for water, hyper-aware of Nathaniel watching him the entire time. "You know," Julian said softly while filling a glass, "you're very different here." Nathaniel leaned back against the couch. "Different from what?" "From your reputation." Nathaniel's expression darkened faintly. "And what exactly is my reputation?" Julian hesitated. "Brilliant, intimidating, difficult." Nathaniel huffed quietly. "That sounds accurate. But not kind," Julian admitted. Nathaniel looked at him carefully then. "And you think I'm kind?" Julian immediately regretted speaking. Because the answer was yes. Painfully yes. Nathaniel waited. Julian stared down into his glass. "You notice when I'm anxious before I do." Silence. Then Nathaniel asked softly, "Has no one ever taken care of you before?" The question hit Julian like a physical blow. Because he didn't know how to answer it. Not honestly. Not without revealing too much. Nathaniel's expression changed immediately. He understood. Julian hated how easily he understood. Nathaniel stood slowly and crossed the room toward him. Every instinct in Julian screamed run. He stayed rooted in place anyway. Nathaniel stopped inches away. Close enough to touch. Close enough to ruin him. "You don't have to look so afraid around me," Nathaniel murmured. Julian's breath caught. "I'm not afraid of you." Nathaniel's eyes softened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "You're afraid of wanting me." The truth of it stole all oxygen from Julian's lungs. Nathaniel lifted one hand slowly, giving Julian every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Julian leaned unconsciously toward him. Nathaniel's fingers brushed gently against his jaw. Warm, careful, devastating. Julian closed his eyes briefly. One touch and he was already unraveling again. "This is breaking the rules," he whispered weakly. Nathaniel stepped even closer. "Then tell me to stop." Julian opened his eyes. Nathaniel was looking at him the same way he had in the hotel suite that night. Hungry, focused, dangerously patient, waiting for permission. Julian should have stepped away. Instead he whispered, "I don't think I can." Nathaniel kissed him immediately. Slow at first, almost tender. But the second Julian kissed him back, something inside Nathaniel snapped. His hand slid into Julian's hair, while he deepened the kiss with restrained desperation that made Julian dizzy. Weeks of tension ignited all at once. Julian gasped softly against Nathaniel's mouth as he was backed gently against the kitchen counter. God, everything about Nathaniel overwhelmed him. The heat of his body, the steadiness of his hands. The way he kissed like Julian was something precious and devastating at the same time. Nathaniel pulled back slightly, breathing uneven now. "This," he said quietly against Julian's lips, "is becoming a serious problem." Julian laughed breathlessly despite himself. "Yeah," he whispered. The worst part? Neither of them looked interested in stopping. Part 4. Cracks in the walls. After the kiss in the kitchen, everything changed. Not dramatically. Worse. Subtly. Nathaniel still reviewed structural reports every morning with maddening professionalism. Julian still pretended he wasn't constantly aware of him. But now, there was history in every glance, heat in every accidental touch, and silence had become the most dangerous thing of all. 3 days later, Julian sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by blueprints while rain hammered the cabin roof. Nathaniel stood beside the long table reviewing digital renderings on his tablet. "You moved the east terrace again," Nathaniel noted. Julian didn't look up. The sunlight angle was wrong. "It wasn't wrong. You just didn't like it." "That's different." Nathaniel's quiet chuckle filled the room. Julian tried not to smile. Failed. Nathaniel noticed immediately. He always noticed. "You smile more here," Nathaniel said casually. Julian froze slightly. "That sounds fake." "It's not." Julian finally glanced up. Nathaniel was watching him with that same unreadable softness again. "Dangerous." Julian looked away first. "You're staring," he muttered. "You're beautiful when you focus." Julian nearly dropped his pencil. "Nathaniel." "What?" Nathaniel asked innocently. "That counts as flirting. You made the rules, not me." Julian glared at him. Nathaniel looked extremely satisfied about it. Infuriating man. That evening the power went out. 1 second the cabin glowed warm with lamplight. The next, darkness. Julian startled violently. "Oh, come on." Thunder rumbled outside. Nathaniel's voice came calmly from somewhere nearby. "Relax. It's probably the storm." "I know it's the storm. That doesn't make it less annoying." A flashlight clicked on. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, illuminated by soft white light, shadows carving sharp lines across his face. Julian's stomach betrayed him instantly. This was ridiculous. "How are you attractive in a blackout?" Julian complained. Nathaniel blinked. "That's your main concern right now?" "Yes." Nathaniel laughed quietly. God, Julian was doomed. They found candles in the kitchen drawers, and soon the cabin glowed with soft, flickering light. Should have felt cozy. Instead it felt intimate in the most dangerous way possible. Nathaniel loosened the sleeves of his dark sweater while checking the fireplace. Julian absolutely did not stare at his forearms. Not even a little. "You're doing it again," Nathaniel said without turning around. Julian crossed his arms defensively. "You can't prove that." Nathaniel finally looked back at him. The candlelight made his gray eyes warmer somehow. "I don't need proof." Julian's heartbeat stumbled. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling against the windows while thunder echoed across the lake. Nathaniel lit another candle and placed it beside Julian's blueprints carefully. "You hate thunderstorms," Nathaniel observed. Julian blinked. "How do you know that?" "You tense every time thunder hits." Julian stared at him. Because Nathaniel said things like that so casually. As if paying attention to Julian was the most natural thing in the world. No one had ever studied him so carefully before. Terrified him. Later that night, Julian stood on the upstairs balcony, wrapped in a blanket watching rain pour across the lake. The storm had softened into steady silver sheets beneath the moonlight. He heard footsteps behind him. Nathaniel handed him a mug quietly. Tea. Exactly the kind Julian liked. Of course he remembered. "Thanks," Julian murmured. Nathaniel leaned against the railing beside him. For a while neither spoke. The silence between them had become strangely peaceful lately. Julian wasn't used to that. Usually silence with other people felt uncomfortable. With Nathaniel it felt safe. And that realization frightened him more than attraction ever could. "You're thinking too loudly again," Nathaniel said softly. Julian huffed a quiet laugh. "Do you ever stop reading my mind?" "No." Julian glanced sideways at him. Nathaniel looked beautiful beneath the moonlight. Sharp features softened by silver shadows. Dark hair slightly messy from the storm air. Julian's chest tightened painfully. This was bad. Very bad. Because somewhere along the way, Nathaniel had stopped feeling temporary. "You're leaving after this project ends," Julian said suddenly. Nathaniel went still beside him. That's usually how consulting works. Julian stared out at the lake. Right? Something heavy settled between them. Nathaniel studied him carefully. Is that bothering you? Julian laughed softly without humor. Shouldn't it? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Julian looked down into his tea. Of course. What exactly had he expected? Nathaniel traveled constantly, worked internationally, belonged to a completely different world. Men like him didn't settle down in quiet places with anxious architects who hated parties and overthought everything. Julian knew that. So why did the thought of Nathaniel leaving suddenly feel unbearable? You're withdrawing, Nathaniel said quietly. Julian hated how accurately he noticed it. I'm being realistic. Nathaniel stepped closer. That sounds suspiciously like self-protection. Julian's throat tightened. Because yes, obviously yes. You barely know me, Julian whispered again. Nathaniel's gaze never left his face. I know you reread books when you're stressed. His voice stayed soft. You pretend not to care about praise even though it affects you deeply. Another step closer. You skip breakfast constantly. Closer still. And you look at buildings like they're alive. Julian's chest hurt. Nathaniel continued quietly. I know you act distant when you're scared someone matters too much. Julian looked away sharply. Too accurate. Far too accurate. Nathaniel reached for him slowly, fingers brushing against Julian's wrist beneath the blanket. Warm. Steady. You keep waiting for me to disappoint you, Nathaniel murmured. Julian swallowed hard. People usually do. Nathaniel's expression shifted then. Not pity. Something sadder. You say that like it's happened often. Julian laughed softly. It's happened enough. Nathaniel's hand tightened slightly around his wrist. For a moment neither moved. Then thunder cracked loudly overhead. Julian flinched instinctively. Nathaniel reacted immediately. 1 second Julian stood alone beneath the blanket. The next Nathaniel had pulled him gently against his chest. Protective. Automatic. Julian froze. Nathaniel seemed to realize what he'd done a second later but didn't let go. And Julian didn't want him to. He could hear Nathaniel's heartbeat beneath the storm. Strong. Steady. Safe. God. No one had ever held him like this before. Not carefully. Not like he mattered. Julian's hands slowly curled into Nathaniel's sweater. Nathaniel exhaled softly against his hair. That tiny sound nearly destroyed him. You make me forget myself, Nathaniel admitted quietly. Julian's breath caught. Nathaniel rested his forehead lightly against Julian's temple. I came here intending to stay professional. Julian laughed weakly. You failed immediately. Nathaniel smiled against his hair. Yes. The honesty of it made Julian's chest ache. Because Nathaniel never seemed embarrassed by wanting him. Meanwhile, Julian felt terrified every second of it. What happens after the project? Julian whispered before he could stop himself. Nathaniel went silent. Julian instantly regretted asking. But then Nathaniel tilted Julian's chin upward gently until their eyes met. And for the first time since they met, Nathaniel looked uncertain too. I don't know yet, he admitted softly. The vulnerability in his voice stunned Julian. Because Nathaniel always seemed so composed, so certain. Seeing uncertainty in him felt strangely intimate. Nathaniel brushed his thumb lightly against Julian's jaw. But I know I'm not ready for this to end. Julian's heart betrayed him completely. Before he could think better of it, he leaned forward and kissed Nathaniel softly. Not desperate this time. Not overwhelmed. Just honest. Nathaniel made a quiet sound against his lips and pulled him closer instantly. The storm raged around the cabin while they kissed slowly beneath the moonlight and rain. And somewhere deep down, Julian realized he was already falling in love with him. Part 5. The Man Behind the Reputation. Julian realized he was in trouble the moment he started memorizing Nathaniel's routines. Not intentionally. It just happened. Nathaniel drank coffee black in the mornings but added sugar after difficult meetings. He rolled up his sleeves whenever he concentrated deeply. He read late into the night when stressed instead of sleeping. And when Nathaniel smiled genuinely, not the polished professional version he showed the world, his eyes softened first. Julian noticed all of it, which was dangerous, because people only paid that much attention when they cared. And Julian cared far too much already. 2 weeks into the cabin stay, the first real fight happened. It started with a blueprint. It ended with Julian storming outside into freezing rain. "You're compromising the entire emotional structure of the project," Julian snapped, glaring across the table. Nathaniel remained infuriatingly calm. "I'm trying to make sure the building actually survives long-term. It survives by meaning something. It also survives by not collapsing." Julian threw his pencil down dramatically. "You're impossible." Nathaniel sighed slowly. "Julian, no, you don't get it." Nathaniel's expression sharpened slightly. "Then explain it to me." Julian froze, because that was the problem. No one ever asked him that. People dismissed him before he could explain. But Nathaniel always listened. And somehow that made emotions harder to control instead of easier. Julian ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "Architecture isn't just structure. It's memory, feeling, human connection." Nathaniel watched him quietly. Julian continued, voice tighter now. "People spend their lives inside buildings. They fall in love there, grieve there, grow old there." His chest rose unevenly. "I want Eden Crescent to feel alive." Silence followed. Nathaniel stared at him for a long moment before speaking softly. "That's why your work matters." Julian blinked. The anger inside him faltered instantly. Nathaniel walked slowly around the table toward him. "You think I'm criticizing the soul of your design," he said quietly. "I'm protecting it." Julian's throat tightened. Nathaniel stopped inches away. "The world already has enough beautiful buildings with no heart." His gray eyes held Julian steadily. "Yours has both. I'm trying to make sure no one ruins that." God, why did Nathaniel always know exactly what to say? Julian looked away first, frustrated with himself more than anything. "You make it very difficult to stay angry at you." Nathaniel's mouth curved faintly. "That sounds like a compliment." "It's not." "It definitely is." Julian groaned dramatically and shoved past him toward the door. "I need air. It's raining." "I know." Nathaniel watched him grab his coat. "You hate rain." "I hate you more right now." Nathaniel actually laughed. Julian glared at him before stepping outside into cold mountain rain. The storm air hit instantly, icy against his face. Good. Maybe it would cool down the chaos inside his chest. He walked toward the edge of the lake, boots crunching against wet gravel while rain soaked through his coat. Stupid, beautiful consultant. Stupid gray eyes. Stupid, caring nature. Julian kicked a rock into the lake aggressively. "You're being dramatic." Julian turned sharply. Nathaniel stood several feet away holding an umbrella. Of course he followed him. "I wanted space," Julian muttered. Nathaniel walked closer anyway. "And yet you only came far enough for me to still see you from the window." Julian opened his mouth, closed it again. Damn him. Nathaniel stopped beside him and tilted the umbrella enough to shield them both from the rain. "You'll get sick," he said simply. Julian stared at the lake. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Take care of me." Nathaniel went quiet. Rain pattered softly above the umbrella while fog curled across the water. Finally Nathaniel said, "No one else does?" The question hurt unexpectedly. Julian shrugged weakly. "Not really." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. Julian immediately regretted answering honestly. He wasn't used to honesty with people, especially not this kind. "My parents were distant," Julian admitted softly. Success mattered more than feelings. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. Julian laughed quietly without humor. "When I got accepted into architecture school, my father asked why I couldn't choose something more practical." His gaze stayed fixed on the water. "I think that was the moment I stopped expecting emotional support from people." Nathaniel looked furious. Not at Julian. For him. That realization nearly shattered something inside Julian, because no one had ever reacted like that before. They were wrong, Nathaniel said flatly. Julian smiled faintly. You don't even know them. I don't need to. Nathaniel stepped closer beneath the umbrella. Anyone who looked at you and failed to see brilliance was wrong. Julian's breath caught painfully. Nathaniel said things like that so naturally. Like praise wasn't dangerous. Like Julian deserved kindness without earning it first. Julian looked down quickly because suddenly his eyes burned. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Of course he did. His voice softened. Julian, I'm fine. You're absolutely not. Julian laughed shakily. See? That's what I mean. You notice everything. Nathaniel reached up slowly and brushed rainwater carefully from Julian's hair. The tenderness of the gesture nearly undid him completely. I notice you, Nathaniel corrected quietly. God, Julian couldn't survive this man much longer. That night, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt different. Softer. More vulnerable somehow. Nathaniel cooked dinner while Julian sat at the counter pretending not to watch him. You're staring again, Nathaniel said without turning around. Julian rested his chin dramatically in his hand. Maybe I enjoy the view. Nathaniel glanced over his shoulder, clearly surprised. Then slowly, very slowly, he smiled. Careful, he murmured. You're flirting. Julian's face heated immediately. Nathaniel looked entirely too pleased about it. Traitor. Dinner became wine. Wine became late-night conversation beside the fireplace. The room glowed gold around them while rain tapped softly against the windows. Nathaniel loosened his collar slightly while listening to Julian ramble about historical architecture. Julian stopped mid-sentence suddenly. Nathaniel looked up. What? Julian stared at him helplessly. You look at me like I matter. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Silence filled the room. Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. Softer. More open. You do matter, he said quietly. Julian's chest hurt. Nathaniel set his glass down and moved closer slowly, giving Julian every opportunity to pull away. Julian stayed completely still. Nathaniel reached him and gently touched his jaw. You matter very much to me. The honesty in his voice destroyed every remaining defense Julian had left. Julian kissed him first this time. Nathaniel inhaled sharply against his lips before pulling him closer immediately. The kiss deepened slowly beside the firelight. Warm, unhurried, dangerously emotional. Nathaniel kissed like a man trying to say things words couldn't hold. Julian melted against him helplessly. When Nathaniel finally pulled back, their foreheads rested together. You're shaking, Nathaniel murmured softly. Julian laughed breathlessly. That's your fault. Nathaniel's thumb brushed gently across his cheek. No, he whispered. I think it's because no one's loved you carefully before. Julian froze. Loved. The word hung between them in the fire-lit silence. Nathaniel seemed to realize what he'd said a second later. But he didn't take it back. And somehow, neither did Julian. Part 6. Almost love. The word lingered long after the fire burned low. Loved. Nathaniel had said it quietly. Accidentally, maybe, but not falsely. Julian knew the difference. That was the problem. He should have panicked. Instead, somewhere deep inside his chest, something fragile unfolded carefully for the first time in years. And that terrified him more than anything else. The next morning, Julian woke to the smell of coffee and cinnamon. For several seconds he stayed still beneath the blankets, listening to the soft sounds downstairs. Cabinet doors opening, a kettle whistling, Nathaniel humming faintly under his breath. Domestic. The realization hit Julian with dangerous warmth. This didn't feel temporary anymore. Felt real, which meant it could hurt him. Julian sat up slowly, heart already uneasy. Outside, snow had begun falling during the night, coating the mountains and lake in soft white silence. Beautiful and isolating. He pulled on a sweater and headed downstairs. Nathaniel stood in the kitchen wearing dark sweatpants and a fitted black shirt, sleeves rolled up while flipping pancakes with suspicious competence. Julian stopped mid-step. "That's unfair," he muttered. Nathaniel glanced over. "Good morning to you too. You cook now." Nathaniel smirked slightly. "I contain multitudes." Julian leaned against the doorway, trying not to stare openly. Failed immediately. Nathaniel looked annoyingly attractive in morning light. Relaxed, warm, real. Not the intimidating consultant everyone feared. Just Nathaniel. And Julian was becoming dangerously attached to that version of him. Nathaniel slid a mug toward him. "Coffee." Julian blinked. Exactly how he liked it. Again. "You remember everything," Julian murmured. Nathaniel looked at him over the rim of his own mug. "Only the important things." Julian's chest tightened painfully. God, how was he supposed to survive this? Work became almost impossible after that. Not because they were distracted, because they worked too well together. Nathaniel understood Julian's ideas before he finished explaining them. Julian anticipated Nathaniel's structural adjustments instinctively. Their minds fit together with alarming ease. It felt intimate in a way Julian couldn't explain. By afternoon, snow trapped them completely inside the cabin. Nathaniel checked the weather report and sighed. "Roads are closed." Julian looked up from his laptop. "For how long?" "At least 2 days." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Julian smiled. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "You're happy about that." Julian tried to hide it. "Maybe I just like snow." "You hate cold weather." Traitorous habits. Nathaniel walked closer slowly, studying him. "You want more time." Julian looked away. Nathaniel's expression softened instantly. God, that expression was becoming dangerous. "You can say it," Nathaniel murmured. Julian laughed weakly. "Why? So you can look unbearably pleased with yourself." "Yes." Julian snorted despite himself. Nathaniel smiled quietly and reached over to tuck a loose strand of hair behind Julian's ear. The touch lingered. Julian stopped breathing for a second. Nathaniel noticed that too. Of course he did. "You're very responsive to me," Nathaniel said softly. Julian's face immediately burned. "That sounded illegal." Nathaniel laughed fully then, warm and genuine. Julian stared helplessly. There it was again. That smile. The real one. And suddenly Julian realized something terrifying. He would do almost anything to keep seeing it. That night, they sat on the floor beside the fireplace sharing whiskey while snowstorm winds rattled softly outside. Julian rested against the couch, legs stretched toward the fire. Nathaniel sat close enough that their shoulders touched occasionally. Neither moved away. "You know," Julian said quietly, "I looked you up after the meeting." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Stalking me already?" "It was professional curiosity." "MMHM." Julian ignored him. "Your reputation is terrifying." "That's usually intentional." Julian studied him carefully. "Why?" Nathaniel stared into the fire for a moment before answering. "Because people take less from you when they're intimidated." The honesty surprised Julian. Nathaniel rarely talked about himself. "You sound tired," Julian murmured. Nathaniel smiled faintly without humor. "I've spent most of my career in rooms full of powerful men trying to prove I belong there." Julian frowned. "You're Nathaniel Vale. Everyone knows you. That doesn't stop them underestimating me." Julian blinked. Underestimating Nathaniel sounded absurd. Nathaniel noticed his expression and laughed softly. "You see the polished version." He swirled whiskey slowly in his glass. "You don't see the years before that." Julian stayed quiet, waiting. Nathaniel looked at him then with surprising openness. "My family lost everything when I was young," he admitted quietly. "I built my career because I was terrified of instability." Julian's chest tightened. Nathaniel rarely sounded vulnerable. "I thought if I became successful enough." Nathaniel continued, "People couldn't leave." Silence filled the room. Julian understood that feeling far too well. "You were lonely," he whispered. Nathaniel's eyes held his steadily. "Yes." The single word hurt, because Julian suddenly saw it clearly. All the confidence, the control, the perfection, armor. Nathaniel had simply learned to wear his loneliness more elegantly than Julian did. Without thinking, Julian reached over and touched his hand lightly. Nathaniel looked down at their fingers, then slowly intertwined them. Warmth spread through Julian instantly. "You know what's unfair?" Julian asked softly. Nathaniel's thumb brushed gently across his knuckles. "What?" "You make me feel safe." Nathaniel went still. Julian immediately regretted admitting it aloud, because safety meant trust. Trust meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant Nathaniel now had the power to break him completely. Nathaniel lifted Julian's hand slowly and pressed a soft kiss against his knuckles. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender that Julian's heart nearly stopped. "You make me feel wanted," Nathaniel confessed quietly. Julian stared at him. Nathaniel looked almost uncertain suddenly, like admitting that mattered. "God." Julian moved before he could overthink it. He shifted closer and kissed Nathaniel gently. Nathaniel responded instantly, one hand sliding carefully to Julian's waist. The kiss deepened slowly beside the fire. Not frantic, not desperate, just intimate in a way that made Julian ache. Nathaniel touched him like he was precious, like he mattered, like this mattered. Julian melted against him helplessly. When Nathaniel finally pulled back, his forehead rested against Julian's. Snowstorm winds howled softly outside while firelight flickered gold across Nathaniel's face. "You're looking at me strangely," Nathaniel murmured. Julian swallowed hard, because he knew exactly what was happening now, and it was irreversible. "I think," Julian whispered shakily, "I'm falling in love with you." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly like the words physically affected him. Then he opened them again and looked at Julian with devastating softness. "You think?" he asked quietly. Julian laughed weakly. "Fine. I know." Nathaniel kissed him again immediately, deep, certain, almost relieved. And somewhere between the snowfall and the firelight, Julian forgot to be afraid for the first time in his life. Part 7. The world outside. Love changed things. Not loudly, not all at once. But after Julian admitted it beside the fireplace, something inside both of them finally stopped pretending. Nathaniel kissed him more openly now, touched him without hesitation, looked at him like he belonged there. And Julian had stopped trying to run from it, which should have made him happy. Instead, a quiet fear had started growing beneath the warmth, because the cabin wasn't real life. Real life waited outside the mountains, and eventually they would have to return to it. The snowstorm cleared 3 days later. By morning, sunlight spilled across the frozen lake while workers finally reopened the roads. Nathaniel stood near the window with his phone pressed to his ear, expression unreadable. Julian watched from the kitchen table silently. The atmosphere felt different already, sharper, more distant. Nathaniel ended the call and rubbed his temple tiredly. Julian's stomach tightened instinctively. "What happened?" Nathaniel looked toward him. "New York." Just one word. But Julian understood immediately. Work. Reality. Nathaniel walked closer slowly. "The board moved up the international review schedule. They want me back next week." Julian's chest went cold. "Next week? That soon?" Nathaniel clearly noticed the shift in his expression because his own softened immediately. "Julian." "It's fine," Julian said too quickly. Nathaniel's gaze narrowed slightly. "You're lying." Julian stood abruptly and carried his empty mug to the sink before Nathaniel could see too much on his face, because suddenly breathing felt difficult. Of course Nathaniel had to leave eventually. Julian always knew that. So why did it feel like someone had quietly reached into his chest and started pulling things apart? Nathaniel approached carefully behind him. "You're withdrawing again." Julian gripped the edge of the counter tighter. "I'm being realistic again." Nathaniel went silent. That silence hurt more than if he'd argued. Julian laughed softly without humor. "See? That's exactly the problem." "What is?" "You don't deny it." Nathaniel frowned slightly. Julian finally turned toward him, emotions too close to the surface now. "You leave," he whispered. That's what people like you do. Something painful flickered across Nathaniel's face. People like me? Julian instantly regretted the wording. But the fear wouldn't stop now that it had started. You belong everywhere, Julian admitted quietly. I belong in one place. Nathaniel stared at him carefully. And you think that means I'll forget you? Julian looked away. Because yes, obviously yes. Nathaniel was brilliant and admired and constantly moving through cities Julian had only seen in magazines. Eventually this cabin would become just another temporary memory to him. Meanwhile Julian would remember everything. That imbalance terrified him. Nathaniel stepped closer. You know what I think? He said softly. Julian didn't answer. Nathaniel reached up gently, forcing Julian to meet his eyes. I think you've spent so long expecting abandonment that you prepare for it before anyone even leaves. The accuracy of it made Julian's throat tighten painfully. Nathaniel's thumb brushed softly against his cheek. I'm not asking for forever right now, he murmured. I'm asking you to stop punishing yourself for caring. Julian's eyes burned unexpectedly. God, why did Nathaniel always see directly through him? 2 days later they returned to the city. And everything immediately became harder. The outside world changed Nathaniel. Not completely, but enough. The moment they stepped back into corporate offices and meetings, the polished consultant returned. Sharp suits, controlled expressions, professional distance. Everyone watched Nathaniel with quiet intimidation. Everyone watched Julian with curiosity. Because people noticed things. Especially the way Nathaniel's attention unconsciously followed Julian around every room. Mira cornered Julian during lunch on the second day back. You're glowing, she said immediately. Julian nearly choked on his coffee. I'm literally exhausted. Nope. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. This is emotional glow. Julian avoided eye contact. You sound insane. You're sleeping with him. Julian inhaled coffee directly into his lungs. Mira looked triumphant. Oh my God. We are not. You absolutely are. Several nearby co-workers looked over curiously. Julian wanted death immediately. Mira, he hissed. She leaned closer dramatically. Julian Hart. The Nathaniel Vale. Julian buried his face in his hands. That bad, huh? She whispered delightedly. You're enjoying this too much. You've been emotionally repressed for years. This is historic. Julian groaned. Unfortunately, she wasn't entirely wrong. That evening, Nathaniel attended a formal investor dinner for Eden Crescent. Julian skipped it intentionally. Crowded social events already drained him normally. Tonight, the idea of watching Nathaniel charm wealthy executives while looking devastating in a suit sounded actively dangerous. So instead Julian stayed late at the office revising project details alone. Or trying to. Mostly he stared blankly at the screen while overthinking everything. Around 10 p.m., his office door opened quietly. Nathaniel stepped inside. Tie loosened. Dark coat hanging open. Expression tired. Julian's heartbeat reacted instantly. You skipped the dinner, Nathaniel observed. You survived. Nathaniel walked closer slowly. Barely. Julian tried not to smile. Failed. Nathaniel noticed immediately, exhaustion easing slightly from his face. There it is, he murmured. There what is? The look you get when you forget to guard yourself. Julian's chest tightened. Nathaniel stopped beside his desk. Up close, he looked drained beneath the polished exterior. You hate these events, Julian realized softly. Nathaniel exhaled quietly. I hate pretending. The honesty surprised him. Nathaniel leaned one hand against Julian's desk and lowered his voice. I spent 3 hours listening to investors praise my vision, while all I could think about was getting back to you. Julian's breath caught. Nathaniel said things like that too easily, too sincerely. Julian stood slowly. The office suddenly felt very small. Nathaniel's eyes drifted across his face carefully, lingering like he was reassuring himself Julian was real. Then, unexpectedly, Nathaniel looked tired in a deeper way. Not physically, emotionally. You know what scares me? Nathaniel asked quietly. Julian blinked. Nathaniel Vale gets scared? Nathaniel smiled faintly. Occasionally. Julian stepped closer instinctively. What scares you? Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment before answering. That I'm going to love you more than you can believe. The confession hit Julian so hard he stopped breathing. Nathaniel's expression remained open, honest, terrifyingly vulnerable. No polished consultant, no careful mask. Just Nathaniel. Julian reached for him immediately. Nathaniel pulled him close the second their hands touched, exhaling shakily against his hair. For a moment they simply stood there holding each other in the quiet office. And Julian realized something important. Nathaniel was scared too. Not of leaving, not of commitment, of being hurt, just like Julian. The realization softened something deep inside him. Julian tilted his head upward slightly. Nathaniel. I think you already do. Nathaniel looked down at him. Then slowly, beautifully, he smiled. Part 8, The Breaking Point. The rumors started quietly. Whispers in hallways. Lingering looks during meetings. Co-workers suddenly becoming very interested whenever Julian and Nathaniel stood too close together. Julian hated every second of it. Nathaniel, infuriatingly, seemed unaffected. How are you so calm? Julian demanded one evening while reorganizing blueprints aggressively. Nathaniel sat across from him reviewing financial reports. About what? People noticing us. Nathaniel looked up slowly. They're noticing you glaring at me like I personally offended you. You do personally offend me. Nathaniel's mouth twitched faintly. And yet you still kissed me goodbye this morning. Julian froze. Nathaniel looked entirely too pleased with himself. You're impossible, Julian muttered. Still here, though. Julian hated how warm those words made him feel. 3 days later, everything collapsed. The Eden Crescent Executive Board scheduled a final presentation with international investors. Huge contracts, media coverage, public attention. Julian already felt overwhelmed before entering the conference hall. Then he saw her, tall, elegant, perfectly dressed, standing beside Nathaniel. Julian slowed immediately. The woman laughed softly at something Nathaniel said, touching his arm familiarly. Something ugly twisted sharply inside Julian's chest. Nathaniel looked up suddenly and immediately noticed him. His expression softened. The woman followed his gaze curiously. Julian looked away first. That hurt more than it should have. He told himself it was irrational, immature. Nathaniel had a life outside Julian, obviously, but the sight of someone fitting so naturally beside him made insecurity rise like poison. Because she looked like she belonged in Nathaniel's world. Julian never did. The presentation became torture after that. Julian stumbled over explanations he'd practiced 100 times. His focus fractured every time he saw the woman beside Nathaniel. And Nathaniel noticed. Of course he did. You skipped 2 slides. Nathaniel murmured quietly during a transition. Julian stiffened. I know. You're distracted. Julian's voice came sharper than intended. I said I know. Nathaniel went still. The tension between them shifted instantly. Julian regretted it immediately, but embarrassment and jealousy made him defensive. The rest of the meeting dragged painfully. When it finally ended, executives flooded toward Nathaniel and the investors. Julian escaped before anyone could stop him. He made it exactly halfway down the empty hallway before Nathaniel caught his wrist gently. Julian. Julian pulled free immediately. Don't. Nathaniel frowned. What happened? Julian laughed softly without humor. You really don't know? No. That somehow made it worse. Julian crossed his arms tightly. Who was she? Nathaniel blinked once. Then realization hit him. And unbelievably, he looked amused. Julian stared at him in disbelief. Oh my God! Nathaniel murmured softly. You do not get to react like that. Nathaniel stepped closer carefully. You were jealous. Julian's face burned instantly. I was not jealous. You were glaring at her like she personally insulted your bloodline. Julian looked away sharply. Nathaniel's expression softened almost painfully. Julian, she fits your world, Julian admitted quietly before he could stop himself. Silence. Nathaniel stared at him, then very gently asked, "And you think you don't?" Julian laughed weakly. "Nathaniel, look at us." "I am." "No, I mean really look." Julian's voice tightened. "You walk into rooms and people orbit around you. You belong everywhere naturally." He swallowed hard. "I barely survive office parties." Nathaniel's expression changed immediately. Not annoyance. Sadness. "Is that honestly how you see yourself?" Julian looked away. "Because yes." Nathaniel stepped closer slowly. "The woman you're jealous of," he said quietly, "is my cousin." Julian froze. "What?" "She's married. With twins." Horror flooded Julian instantly. Nathaniel watched him with visible effort not to laugh. "Oh my God!" Julian whispered, mortified. Nathaniel finally lost the battle and laughed quietly. Julian covered his face immediately. "This is your fault somehow." "My fault. You're too attractive." "Creates confusion." Nathaniel looked delighted by that answer. Julian groaned dramatically. But Nathaniel's amusement faded quickly when he noticed Julian still looked genuinely upset beneath the embarrassment. His expression softened again. "You really think you don't belong beside me?" Nathaniel said quietly. Julian didn't answer. Nathaniel reached up slowly and pulled Julian's hands away from his face. "Look at me." Julian hesitated, then obeyed. Nathaniel's gray eyes held his steadily. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by polished people," he murmured. "Beautiful conversations. Expensive dinners. Perfect appearances." Julian's throat tightened. Nathaniel stepped even closer. "And none of them ever made me feel what you do." The hallway suddenly felt too small, too intimate. Nathaniel's hand slid gently along Julian's jaw. "You think I belong everywhere," he whispered. "But you're the first place that's ever felt like home." Julian's breath caught painfully. "God." Nathaniel said things that rearranged him from the inside out. Julian shook his head weakly. "You can't just say things like that." Nathaniel's expression softened further. "Why not? They're true." Julian's eyes burned unexpectedly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. He always did. "You're overwhelmed?" Nathaniel murmured. Julian laughed shakily. "That's becoming a permanent condition around you." Nathaniel smiled faintly. Then his expression turned serious again. "There's something else," he admitted quietly. Julian's stomach tightened instantly. "What?" Nathaniel hesitated. And suddenly Julian hated that hesitation. "The board offered me a permanent position in New York," Nathaniel said softly. The world stopped. Julian stared at him. "Permanent. Not temporary travel. Not consulting. Permanent." Nathaniel watched the realization hit him in real time. "I haven't answered them yet," he added quickly. But Julian barely heard him. Because suddenly every fear he'd tried to suppress came rushing back all at once. Of course this would happen. Nathaniel belonged in cities and boardrooms and international projects. Not here. Not with Julian. The panic must have shown clearly on his face because Nathaniel immediately reached for him. "Julian, you want it." Nathaniel went quiet. That silence became an answer too. Julian stepped backward instinctively. His chest hurt. Actually hurt. "I worked my whole life for opportunities like this," Nathaniel admitted softly. Julian nodded once. There it was. Reality. He should have expected this. Nathaniel noticed him retreating emotionally and moved closer again urgently. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Leave before I've even made a decision." Julian laughed softly without humor. "You already did." Nathaniel looked almost stricken by that. But Julian couldn't stop now. Because suddenly he felt stupid for ever believing something this fragile could survive outside the cabin. "You said you weren't asking for forever," Julian whispered. Nathaniel's expression tightened painfully. "I wasn't. Then I met you." God, that should have helped. Instead it made everything worse. Because Julian believed him. And believing him meant this could actually break his heart. Nathaniel reached for him again carefully. But this time, Julian stepped away. Part 9, The Place I Choose. Julian avoided Nathaniel for 3 days. Not successfully, because Nathaniel refused to let him disappear completely. There were still meetings, project revisions, shared responsibilities. But outside of work, Julian withdrew behind carefully rebuilt walls. Short answers, avoided eye contact, professional distance. It was exhausting, and worse, it was hurting Nathaniel. Julian could see it every time their eyes met across conference tables. Nathaniel looked calmer than Julian expected, controlled. But Julian knew him now. He noticed the subtle things, the tension in Nathaniel's jaw, the exhaustion beneath his eyes, how quiet he became whenever Julian pulled away. It would have been easier if Nathaniel looked unaffected. Instead, he looked heartbroken, and Julian hated himself for causing it. On the 4th night, Julian stayed late at the office intentionally. The building was nearly empty by midnight, city lights glowing beyond the glass walls, while rain tapped softly against the windows. Rain again. Somehow it always came back to rain. Julian sat alone at his desk staring blankly at unfinished renderings. He wasn't working anymore, just thinking, overthinking, exactly as Nathaniel always accused him of doing. The office door opened quietly. Julian didn't look up immediately. He already knew. Nathaniel stepped inside slowly, coat dark from rain, expression tired in a way Julian had never seen before. Not physical exhaustion, emotional. "You're avoiding me," Nathaniel said softly. Julian stared at the blueprints. "I'm working." At midnight. Silence. Nathaniel closed the door behind him. The quiet click echoed through the empty office. Julian's pulse betrayed him instantly. Nathaniel walked closer carefully, like approaching something wounded. That realization hurt, because Julian was wounded, and Nathaniel knew it. "I don't know how to fix this," Julian admitted quietly. Nathaniel stopped beside the desk. "You could start by talking to me." Julian laughed weakly. "You make that sound easy." Nathaniel's voice softened further. "It should be." Julian finally looked up. Big mistake. Nathaniel looked devastating. Rainwater still clung faintly to his dark hair. His tie was loosened, and his eyes, God, his eyes looked wrecked. "You were really going to leave?" Julian whispered. Nathaniel's expression tightened. "I was considering it." "That's not better." Nathaniel exhaled slowly and dragged a hand through his hair. "You think this is simple for me?" Julian stood abruptly. "Yes." Nathaniel blinked in disbelief. "You honestly believe that? You belong in New York." Nathaniel stared at him for a long moment, then very quietly asked, "And where do you think you belong?" Julian frowned slightly. "Here." Nathaniel stepped closer. "With your work?" "Yes." "With your friends?" "Yes." Nathaniel's voice lowered. "What about with me?" Julian froze. Nathaniel moved even closer now, close enough that Julian could feel warmth radiating from him. "You keep talking like love is a competition against ambition," Nathaniel murmured. "Like one of them has to lose." Julian looked away sharply, because maybe that was exactly what he believed. Nathaniel noticed immediately. "Who taught you that?" he asked softly. Julian's throat tightened. "My parents," he admitted quietly. "Everyone, really?" Nathaniel's expression softened painfully. Julian laughed weakly. "You leave eventually. People always choose what matters more." Nathaniel stared at him like the words physically hurt. Then suddenly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Julian blinked. "What's that?" Nathaniel placed it gently on the desk between them. Julian looked down slowly. "The New York contract," and signed. His breath caught. Nathaniel watched him carefully. "I was supposed to submit it yesterday." Julian looked back up immediately. Nathaniel's gaze never wavered. "I couldn't." The room felt suddenly too small, too quiet. "Why?" Julian whispered. Nathaniel stepped closer until only inches separated them. "Because every time I pictured leaving," he admitted softly, "the only thing I could think about was losing you." Julian's chest hurt violently. Nathaniel continued, voice rougher now. I built my entire life around career success because I thought achievement would finally make me feel complete. He laughed quietly without humor. Then you happened. Julian's eyes burned. Nathaniel reached up slowly and touched his face gently. And suddenly none of it felt more important than being where you are. Julian closed his eyes briefly. God, no one had ever chosen him before. Not first. Not completely. Nathaniel's thumb brushed softly beneath his eye. You asked me once what happens after the project ends, he murmured. Julian opened his eyes again. Nathaniel looked terrified now. Actually terrified. And somehow that mattered more than any grand speech ever could. Here's the truth, Nathaniel whispered. I don't know what the future looks like. His voice shook slightly for the first time since Julian met him. But I know I want you in it. Something inside Julian finally broke open completely. All the fear, all the self-protection, all the certainty that love always ended in abandonment. Nathaniel had stayed. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but he stayed. Julian laughed shakily through burning eyes. You're ruining my ability to emotionally repress myself. Nathaniel let out a startled breath of laughter. The sound cracked with relief. Julian reached for him then. Nathaniel pulled him close instantly like he'd been holding himself back for days. And maybe he had. Julian buried his face against Nathaniel's neck while Nathaniel held him tightly enough to say everything words couldn't. Safe. Wanted. Chosen. Nathaniel kissed his hair softly. I love you, he whispered. Simple. Certain. Real. Julian's chest nearly gave out under the weight of it. He pulled back just enough to look at him. Nathaniel's carefully controlled composure was completely gone now. And somehow Julian loved him even more like this. Honest. Open. Human. I love you too, Julian whispered back. Nathaniel kissed him immediately. Deep. Relieved. Overwhelmingly tender. Rain blurred the city lights outside while months of tension and fear dissolved between them all at once. When the kiss finally broke, Nathaniel rested his forehead against Julian's. So, Julian murmured breathlessly. What now? Nathaniel smiled softly. The board still wants Eden Crescent completed. Julian rolled his eyes affectionately. Romantic. I'm serious. Nathaniel brushed his thumb gently across Julian's cheek. I turned down New York. Julian's breath caught again. Nathaniel smiled faintly at his expression. I told them I'm staying here. Here. Julian asked weakly. Nathaniel's eyes softened. Yes, here. Julian stared at him helplessly. Do you understand? He whispered. That I might actually cry? Nathaniel looked unbearably fond suddenly. I know. Julian laughed softly through tears anyway. Then Nathaniel kissed him again beneath rain-soaked city lights while the unfinished Eden Crescent blueprints rested forgotten across the desk between them. And for the first time in Julian's life, love didn't feel temporary. Felt like home. Epilogue, Eden Crescent. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed about Eden Crescent was the light. Morning sunlight spilled through curved glass walkways and open garden terraces exactly the way Julian had imagined years ago. The buildings didn't feel cold or corporate like most modern developments. They felt alive, warm, human, intentional. Architecture magazines called it revolutionary. Julian thought that sounded dramatic. Nathaniel thought it sounded accurate. You're staring at the building again, Nathaniel murmured beside him. Julian glanced sideways with a small smile. I literally designed it. And yet you look surprised every time you see it. Julian looked back toward the skyline. The grand opening celebration buzzed around them. Investors, journalists, photographers, city officials. Normally events like this would have exhausted him within minutes. But Nathaniel stood beside him with one hand warm against the small of his back, grounding him effortlessly. It still amazed Julian sometimes. How safe love could feel in the right hands. You're thinking too loudly again, Nathaniel observed. Julian huffed quietly. You're still annoyingly observant. It's part of my charm. You're assuming you have charm. Nathaniel looked genuinely offended. Julian laughed softly. God, a year later and he still loved making Nathaniel laugh. Things hadn't magically become perfect after that night in the office. Nathaniel still traveled occasionally for work. Julian still overthought everything. They still argued passionately about architecture at least twice a week. But now there was certainty beneath it all. Nathaniel came home, every time, and Julian had slowly learned that love didn't disappear the moment life became complicated. Sometimes it stayed. Sometimes it chose you back. The realization had changed him quietly over the past year. He smiled easier now, spoke more confidently during presentations, stopped apologizing before every opinion. Nathaniel noticed every change with unbearable fondness. "You're doing it again," Julian muttered. Nathaniel blinked innocently. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like I personally invented happiness." Nathaniel considered that seriously. "You improved it significantly." Julian rolled his eyes affectionately while trying not to blush. Failed immediately. Nathaniel still found that adorable, which remained deeply unfair. The crowd inside the main atrium applauded as another speech concluded. Mira appeared beside them holding champagne. "There you are." She handed Julian a glass dramatically. "Your fans are asking for you." Julian looked alarmed. "I have fans. You're on 3 magazine covers. That feels illegal." Nathaniel looked extremely pleased about this information. Mira narrowed her eyes at him. "And you?" She pointed accusingly. "Stop looking smug. You're already unfairly attractive." Nathaniel smiled politely. "I'll do my best." "You won't," Julian muttered. Nathaniel's hand slipped briefly around Julian's waist beneath the noise of the crowd. Small touch. Automatic. "Home." Mira watched the interaction and sighed dramatically. "You two are disgustingly in love." Julian immediately looked embarrassed. Nathaniel did not. "Yes," he said calmly. Julian stared at him. Mira burst into delighted laughter. "You see?" she told Julian. "This is why he wins every argument." Nathaniel leaned closer slightly. "I don't win every argument." "You absolutely do," Julian said. Nathaniel kissed his temple softly before Julian could protest further. Mira made fake gagging noises and walked away. Julian buried his face briefly in Nathaniel's shoulder. "I can't believe this is my life." Nathaniel's voice softened above him. "Good or bad?" Julian looked up slowly. Nathaniel still stole his breath sometimes. Even now. Especially now. Because Julian knew the man beneath the polished exterior now. The lonely, ambitious boy who built walls out of success. The exhausted consultant who feared being abandoned. The gentle man who remembered exactly how Julian took his coffee every morning. Julian loved all of him. "Definitely good," Julian whispered. Nathaniel's expression softened instantly. That look still wrecked Julian completely. Later that night, long after the celebration ended, they stood alone on the highest terrace of Eden Crescent overlooking the city lights. Wind moved softly through the rooftop gardens while music echoed faintly from distant streets below. Julian leaned against the railing quietly. Nathaniel stepped beside him holding 2 glasses of wine. "For the architect," he said, offering one. Julian accepted it with a smile. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while. The best kind. The kind Julian once thought only existed in movies. Nathaniel finally glanced toward him. "You know," he said softly, "I never told you something." Julian raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "The night we met at the hotel?" Julian's chest warmed instantly at the memory. "What about it?" Nathaniel looked almost thoughtful. "I recognized you immediately." Julian blinked. "You said you recognized my work." "I did." Nathaniel's gray eyes held his steadily. "But I also recognized you." Julian frowned slightly. "From where?" Nathaniel took a slow sip of wine before answering. 3 years ago. Tokyo Design Conference." Julian stared at him blankly. Nathaniel looked amused now. "You were sitting alone outside the main ballroom sketching buildings in a notebook because the networking event overwhelmed you." Julian's jaw dropped slightly. That was you. Nathaniel nodded once. You dropped your pen. His smile softened with memory. You apologized to the floor. Julian covered his face immediately. Oh my God. Nathaniel laughed quietly. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. Julian looked up sharply. Nathaniel's expression remained completely sincere. You never spoke to me, Julian whispered. I wanted to. Nathaniel stepped closer slowly. But you looked like you might spontaneously combust if a stranger approached you. That's fair. Nathaniel smiled warmly. So when I saw you at the hotel bar, he shook his head softly. It felt impossible. Julian's chest hurt in the best way now. All this time Nathaniel had already noticed him. You fell first, Julian whispered triumphantly. Nathaniel looked deeply unbothered. Obviously. Julian laughed softly. Then Nathaniel reached up and touched his face gently beneath the city lights. But you, he murmured, fell harder. Julian opened his mouth to deny it. Failed immediately. Nathaniel kissed him before he could try. Slow, warm, certain. The city stretched endlessly around them while wind moved softly through the gardens Julian designed and Nathaniel helped bring to life. Their building, their future, their impossible love story. And somewhere between the rain-soaked beginning and this quiet rooftop ending, Julian realized something beautiful. The best parts of his life had started the moment he stopped running from being loved. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe and like for more wonderful BL stories.